At this point, I don't think there's any disputing that the original Cities Skylines reinvigorated the city builder genre on its release in 2015, but that doesn't mean it made everyone happy, and fans of SimCity were often its harshest critics, myself included. Cities Skylines is a great game, don't get me wrong, but it did feel like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. Now that Cities Skylines II has launched and it promises to tweak, tune, and reinvent many of the original's mechanics, I wanted to revisit whether or not it is enough to eclipse the legacy of SimCity, or if some fans of that retro franchise might still be a bit disappointed. Okay, so the first point I want to bring up is the presentation, and that includes the graphics and audio. And this is actually a very important and I think sometimes overlooked point. I think one of the best things about the SimCity franchise, and in fact everything that Maxis did back in the 90s and early 2000s, was the personality that they had to those games. There was a lot of humor and wit to the SimCity franchise, from the newspaper reports you would receive in SimCity 2000 to the various humorous alien attacks and other disasters that were included, to the rioting that would break out in front of the mayor's mansion if the city was not going so well. These all gave the game a lot of character, and they were flanked by really excellent graphics with superb art design, and, I think it's oftentimes forgotten, a generally really good soundtrack. Cities Skylines II does make some improvements. The UI and the 3D graphics are still pretty generic in terms of their artistic style, but the game adds some new radio stations that come complete with hosts that will comment on the status of your city. And the commentary is actually genuinely funny, and I thought that it was really enjoyable, and it also does provide some insight on your city. However, it's not all good news, because the commentary does end up becoming pretty repetitive, and it's also not always accurate. Sometimes actually you will get a negative commentary followed by a positive commentary about the exact same thing, like say your city's industry, which is quite confusing. So that's something that needs some improvement. I would be interested to see how modders actually add some more radio hosts. There's also multiple radio stations so that you can pick the sort of general vibe of music that you're looking for. Although again, repetitiveness is an issue. The tracks are fairly limited numbers, it seems like. So that's something I think could also be improved by modders or in future expansions. So let's get into the graphics, which I think is going to be a very controversial point for sure. I think the graphical style is still very generic, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. I think very clearly Colossal Order has chosen to go this direction. They want to have a city builder for everyone. And to be fair, there are now both North American and European style buildings in the game. You can select between them when you're setting up your city or at any time when zoning, and that is appreciated. But in general, I do think that Colossal Order could do more to bring a distinct feeling to the look of Cities Skylines 2. But that is not what is going to be controversial. What's going to be controversial is the overall graphics fidelity and the game's performance. In fact, Colossal Order already knows this is going to be an issue, because they put out a statement a few days before the video was put up saying they didn't meet their internal performance benchmarks and that they are going to be continuing to optimize the game after release. This, of course, is not good, although I would like to sort of point out that this is a pretty retro thing for them to do, because honestly, most of the SimCity games had some troubles at the time of their release as well, especially SimCity 4. With that said, however, if you played Cities Skylines or if you play the SimCity games and you're fine getting by with your current rig, because those are older titles now, you are in for an unpleasant surprise. I have a Radeon RX 7800 XT, which I got very recently. It is a very new card with 16 gigabytes of video RAM, and even so, I was seeing frame rates in the 30s at 3440 by 1440 resolution and high detail. And I saw VRAM usage over 12 gigabytes, which is really going to cause headaches, because a lot of people have video cards with 12 or even 8 gigabytes of video memory. So is it worth it? Is Cities Skylines 2 a visually stunning game in the same way that the SimCity games were when they originally came out? I would say no, not really. I mean, look, you can look at the footage for yourself. But personally, I think sometimes it looks great and sometimes it looks pretty bad. Now, let's be clear, this is at its best a high watermark for the visuals in a city building game. When you get into a busy part of your city and you zoom in and you look at the people walking around and the buses moving and you look at the beautiful skyscrapers and all of that going on, it looks great. However, if you're looking at a small suburb that is in an empty plain that doesn't have a lot of trees around it, it looks pretty generic and boring and not visually stunning whatsoever. One of the strangest things to me is that if you look at an empty map and you look at the portions of the empty map that don't have anything on it, I honestly think SimCity 4 looks better than Cities Skylines 2. There is more detail in the terrain. In fact, if you zoom in SimCity 4, one of the most humorous things about that game is you'll see all kinds of wildlife running around, so much so that it's actually kind of humorous and unrealistic. But if you zoom in to an empty spot in Cities Skylines 2, you see nothing. So that is definitely an issue that I would like to see the game really work on. I was hoping it's something that would be improved with the sequel, but apparently it's not. Of course, if you go back to Cities Skylines, there is obviously an upgrade. In particular, the buildings and the vehicles and the pedestrians are all way more detailed than they were before, have higher resolution textures, there's better animations, they behave more intelligently, so that all looks excellent. But it's a real mixed bag, folks. And if you are a fan of the older SimCity games and you really like the visual style of those games, I am not sure that you're going to be very impressed. Okay, now let's get into the meat and potatoes of the review and of Cities Skylines 2 and its comparison to older SimCity titles. And that, of course, is the simulation of the city itself. And let's start with the most important thing to the Cities Skylines franchise, which is traffic and transit. Cities Skylines 2 is still an agent-based simulation, and that means it has individual AI entities which behave according to their wants and needs that have been programmed into them. However, for the sequel, those wants and needs have been made more complex and agents behave more intelligently than they did before, a lot more intelligently, in fact. Also, and this is a big one, the agents can change their minds about their path and route. That is huge because in the original game, the agents could get confused and stuck. They had this really bad habit of funneling towards one or two lanes and then just sitting there waiting for the heat death of the universe. And I think this is going to be a really important improvement, actually, if you're a fan of SimCity, because while SimCity 4's traffic simulation was technically a lot less realistic than Cities Skylines because it lacked the AI agents, it was also a lot less fiddly. And especially after the SimCity 4 Rush Hour expansion, traffic felt just more organic and dynamic in that game, in my opinion, than it did in Cities Skylines. I think a very common criticism of Cities Skylines from the SimCity community was that Cities Skylines, the original, felt like a traffic simulator and not a city simulator. And I do think that Cities Skylines 2 does a lot to resolve that. You can have a city that has some traffic jams, and it's not going to completely demolish that city's fortunes. In fact, the city can still do pretty well, and I actually love that. I think that's important because, let's face it, all successful big cities have a lot of traffic. That is just a fact of big cities. So I always thought it was weird in Cities Skylines that traffic could become so much of an issue. I'm also happy to report that Cities Skylines 2 retains and improves on the game's advantages in public transit. This is an area that Cities Skylines was way better than SimCity 4 or any SimCity game. The AI agents allowed the creation of legitimate routes for public transit, and the routes mattered because the actual buses and trains appeared on the map and moved on the map, which is not something that happened in the SimCity games. The route managers are still excellent, very easy to use, very easy to visualize how your routes are going about your city. Also, they've improved some things like the way train tracks are laid down. They were very finicky in Cities Skylines. Now, train tracks are still maybe a little harder to lay down than roads, but they do feel pretty easy to use. I was adding some trains to my city last night, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So, public transit already was better than the SimCity franchise, and now it is way better than the SimCity franchise. In fact, that is really becoming the number one thing I miss if I go back and play the SimCity games today. I really do miss having that mass transit element of the game. It's just not much fun in the SimCity franchise compared to Cities Skylines, and Cities Skylines 2 really aces that. Something else that Cities Skylines 2 gets right is ploppables. Now, if you're a SimCity fan, you probably know what I'm talking about, but if not, ploppables are the buildings that you put down on the map yourself instead of zoning. So think hospitals, schools, police headquarters, that sort of thing. Now, traditionally, these were a very important part of all city building simulations, including SimCity and City Skylines II, but they often looked and felt extremely generic and were surprisingly small compared to some of the buildings surrounding them. That is radically changed in City Skylines II. Ploppables are now huge. They take up a lot of space on the map. Because of that, they are very visually detailed. They look great. There's also a lot of ploppables. For example, with schools, you've got elementary schools, high schools. Then you have colleges and universities, and also some specialty universities, and a particle collider you can build if you really want to focus on science and education. And because all of these facilities are quite large, and some of them have upgrades that, if you choose them, also take up additional space on a map, they become very prominent parts of your city. They become landmarks, which is what they should be. And they are also buildings that you need to plan for when building out your city grid or thinking about how your city is arranged. And really, no matter how well you plan, you probably are going to have to at some point go back and put in a large ploppable in the middle of some dense part of your city where you didn't think you were going to need to have that service. And I really like that because that's how cities work, right? Cities actually develop organically. And then all of a sudden you realize, wow, I'm going to need to have a train service in the middle of my downtown area because otherwise my traffic jams are going to get out of hand. And you have to go in and you have to rezone an area. You have to demolish buildings in order to make that work. And that is something I've never really felt in a city simulator before, because even in the SimCity franchise, those ploppables were important, but they were generally kind of small. So it really wasn't that hard to fit them in if you needed to add some sort of service to your city. In City Skylines 2, it's a lot more involved, and I appreciate that. There's also improvements to the utilities, which is something that I've mentioned City Skylines did not improve on a lot over the SimCity franchise. Water is still fairly simple, but there are multiple water treatment plants, and some of them are pretty large, so you do have to think about how you're going to accommodate those in your city. Electricity is actually kind of interesting because there is both low voltage and high voltage electricity. The low voltage electricity is what is used by normal buildings in the city simulator, while high voltage electricity forms the electrical grid between your power plants. And there are actually transformer stations that you need to use to convert the electricity from high to low voltage when you're building a suburb in a remote part of your city. It's not a lot of extra detail, but it does add a little nuance, and actually you will find that high voltage electricity lines can be a little hard to accommodate sometimes, and again, it adds something more that you need to think about, and something that you don't really find in the SimCity franchise. But there's also a really nice quality of life feature that's been incorporated, which is simply that roads now, by default, include electrical lines and water and sewer lines beneath them. Maybe not technically the most realistic thing, but let's face it, that's how most people arrange their grids and their water and their sewer in their cities anyway. And just having those incorporated already for you for the roads takes a little bit of needless busy work out of the simulation. But of course, you can also still run your lines for power, your water and sewer yourself. And sometimes you will still need to, because the built-in power, sewer, and water does not include some types of roads like highways. Building a highway out to a suburb, you're also going to have to find a way to get your water, sewer, and electricity to that suburb. So it's a nice, I think, balance between fiddly busy work and adding detail to the simulation. And overall, I think the ploppables and the utilities in City Skylines 2 are a very clear upgrade over what was available in the SimCity franchise. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the economy, which is another very important part of any city builder simulation. And it is something that has been greatly overhauled, and it now reminds me a lot of the economy in the 2013 SimCity reboot, which had a pretty heavy focus on resources and supply chains, at least compared to previous SimCity games. There is 6 raw resources in City Skylines 2 and over a dozen produced resources that a city will demand to varying degrees. Cities can run deficits or surpluses of these resources based on their production, which usually occurs in industrial buildings, but in some cases may also occur in offices. And providing a city with access to raw resources, which are usually found on the map, can make a business more or less profitable, or at least that's the way it's supposed to work on paper. The details of how exactly that works are not very transparent in the game, but I did notice at times that my industry said they were unprofitable because of a lack of access to resources. So apparently it does do something. Now, this is something that, of course, is not found really in the older SimCity titles, so not including the 2013 reboot. And I think it is going to be a matter of taste for fans of SimCity. Now, on the one hand, this goes beyond the classic RCI meter that's iconic to SimCity, and it offers another way for players to engage with and work on the economy. As an aside to that, the RCI-style demand is still present, and it's also expanded. Office is now its own zone, whereas I believe prior it was a subset of industrial, and residential is now broken into low, medium, and high density categories. So you have 6 types of zoning plus the economy to keep track of. And it is a lot, but I think this is also maybe a little bit of a controversial change. It does bring diversity to the city simulation, but it also expands the borders of the city simulation in a way that is maybe arguably not that relevant to what a city simulation really is at its core. I guess you have to ask yourself whether or not you see resource management as being part of a city's core identity. Personally, I don't know. It's a little strange to me because obviously the raw resources a city has access to can have an impact on its culture and its look and its industries. But on the other hand, the largest cities in the world, whether it's New York City or Tokyo, Paris, or just pick any large global city you can possibly think of, that city is going to be an importer of tons and tons of goods. It's not going to be successful primarily because it is exporting from a local industry. There may be industries outside of that city or near that city or in the same county or in the same country which are doing well, but I don't feel like resource management is really the business of city governments by and large. I have a feeling that some people would disagree about this, so let me know what you think in the comments. I really am kind of undecided on this change right now. It does add a little diversity in what you do in the gameplay, but on the other hand, it does feel like a bit of a distraction from other systems, and I don't think it helps that there's only 6 resources in the game right now, and that the way the industrial specialized areas are zoned is a bit fiddly, and also the graphical effects that go along with these don't look the best, so I definitely think there is more work for Colossal Order to do here if they want to make it a really critical part of the simulation. Now, before we wrap up talking about the simulation, I want to go into a few minor points that are nonetheless important. One of these is the scale of Cities Skylines II. I feel like the scale of the game is still a lot smaller than SimCity 3000 or SimCity 4, certainly. In this aspect, it is very similar in feel to Cities Skylines, which is interesting because Colossal Order actually has made some changes here. They've made some tweaks to the amount of people that live in buildings to try and make that appear more realistic, especially in the more dense buildings that are in the game. The high density residential, medium density residential buildings have more occupants than before. And in general, dense urban core does feel more realistically busy. However, to me, the scale of Cities Skylines II still feels like that of a scale model of a city. In most cases, a city of this 25,000 people can end up having a high-density urban core with multiple skyscrapers, and it just is what it is. But if you are a fan of SimCity 4 and you really liked the vast scale in SimCity 4, you're probably going to be a bit disappointed by that. I know that I am. Also, while the size of the maps in Cities Skylines 2 has been improved over the original game, there is still no region system where you can have multiple cities that appear on the same regional map and influence each other. So that is also honestly a disappointment. I was really hoping they would go ahead with a feature like that in Cities Skylines 2, but it's still not here, and that is something I very much miss from SimCity 4. Now, disasters are another part of the simulation that have not changed very much. They are still really boring and they really lack personality compared to SimCity. Disaster management is included in the game by default, which I believe was an expansion feature in the original, but unfortunately, it's still really boring and pointless. I really don't understand why this system is in the game. And the bunkers that you build to have residents take shelter in during a disaster are both unrealistic. I'm sorry, but unless you live in a city that frequently experiences war, which unfortunately there are cities in the real world that do, but most cities don't. And you're not going to walk around New York City or Tokyo and see, oh, look, there is our fallout shelter. Yeah, we've got one every 3 blocks to make sure we have good accommodations for everyone. So yeah, I'm glad we have those. Like, no, that's just not a thing. It's not a thing. And I am fine with the system trying to be just a generalized way of representing disaster response if it was fun, but it's not fun. It's boring, and it rarely happens anyway. So I don't understand why this system is included. Now, one system that can negatively impact your city, and which is a bit improved, is pollution, which does feel more impactful. In particular, air pollution seems to travel quite a ways in Cities Skylines 2. I definitely felt like I had to plan for it more. On the other hand, ground pollution is still pretty much just, don't build a water tower next to your dump and you'll be fine. But I am glad to see there was a little bit of impact from the pollution system in how I planned out my city. Finally, while the ploppables, as I mentioned, look really nice, and some of them are very functional, in particular the ones that have to do with transit, in general, the way ploppables work still hasn't honestly changed that much compared to the SimCity franchise. There is still, it seems, a certain radius into which these ploppables provide a happiness boost for citizens. And while it is true that vehicles need to get to these ploppables in order for particular citizens to visit them, and practically speaking, unless you make a terrible, awful, horrible road network, this ends up just being a radius too, because citizens are generally going to go to services that are nearby that they can readily get through, and it just ends up working like a radius, which is basically how everything worked in the SimCity franchise too. And I mean, that's fine, but I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit more innovation in that area of the simulation. Okay, with all that said, what is my verdict on the simulation in Cities Skylines 2? I think it is definitely an improvement. Maybe a good improvement, a nice improvement, a noticeable improvement. In some ways, it can be a game-changing improvement, particularly with the improvements to the traffic simulation. Perhaps the most important point is that I'm enjoying it, and I think that over time I will get more enjoyment from this simulation than I did with Cities Skylines, which I did play for several hundred hours, so obviously, I liked it. However, with that said, if you are a SimCity fan, if you in particular are a diehard of that franchise and you were not really that interested in what Cities Skylines had to offer, I'm not sure that there's anything here that's necessarily going to change your mind. And in particular, the sheer scale of what you can achieve in SimCity 4 still looks like it's unrivaled by Cities Skylines 2. I have no doubt some people will make some really, really big cities in Cities Skylines 2, but from what I can see so far, that's not going to compare to the size of the regions in SimCity 4. And, there's going to be plenty of debate back and forth about whether or not the region system in SimCity 4 is comparable to having a particular city on a map in Cities Skylines 2. But for me, the two games do feel distinct, which in some ways, could be kind of nice because you can play both of them side by side and get enjoyment from different aspects of them. I'm really interested to see how Cities Skylines 2 develops over time, and I think probably the best thing I can say about the simulation is that it does reaffirm the direction of the franchise. And I think Cities Skylines was obviously an amazingly successful game, but if it was followed up by a bad sequel, the legacy of the franchise could still have been in question. Now I think with Cities Skylines 2, Colossal Order is successful and starting to build its own legacy that will, over time, be as impactful for players that were new to city builders with the Cities Skylines franchise as the SimCity franchise was impactful for me and other players who first encountered city builders through those games. Now, another distinct aspect of a city builder I want to spend a little time talking about is the interface. I'm not going to go as in-depth on this because, to be honest, Cities Skylines already had an amazing interface that in general worked and looked a lot better than any of the SimCity games. This was just the nature of it no longer being on a grid. It was a lot easier to build curved roads. I mean, it was possible to build curved roads without mods. The data visualizations were generally much better than anything you would find in any of the SimCity games. And also because there were the individual AI agents that you could look at and follow around the city, it gave you the potential to see in real time how things were working in your city. And in general, all this is true for Cities Skylines 2 and in fact has been improved in some ways. The visualizations for things like traffic, pollution, water, sewer, and electricity are all more functional and look better than in the original game. There's also plenty of graphs and charts to help you look into your economy. Although they are somewhat hidden from view, you might not notice them at first. You have to go look into your budgeting view and then click on particular tabs in order to find these. Would be nice if they were a bit more upfront. One thing that is still missing, it looks like, is that unlike in SimCity 4, you cannot tweak funding per building. I do wish that was possible, but it looks like it's city-wide, which means there's a little bit of micromanagement that you can't go into. That's maybe too bad. I would have liked to have seen that. But again, in general, Cities Skylines remains much better in terms of interface than any of the SimCity games. And if you liked what you saw in Cities Skylines, then you're going to like what you saw in Cities Skylines 2 even more. Okay, we are just about done here. There's only a few more things that I think might be relevant to players of SimCity and that I want to get into. First of all is the difficulty. I think that Cities Skylines 2 is really easy and probably easier overall than SimCity 2000, 3000, or SimCity 4. This is primarily because of the milestones system in the game. Now, in Cities Skylines 2, you get a lot of money for each milestone. And in addition to that, you gain points that can be used to unlock new city services. I like this system because it gives you some choice in the progression of how things unlock, but those points are free and the unlocks are free, so that's not putting any sort of strain on your financials. Also, the improvements to the traffic simulation, although appreciated, they do make the game easier because you're going to be a lot less likely to end up with bottlenecks early on in your city. And so you don't have to plan quite as carefully for your initial city layout. Because of this, I think if you're an experienced SimCity fan, you're not going to find a lot of challenge here. On the other hand, maybe you're not looking for one. I personally feel like I wish the game was a little more difficult. As you can see, New York City is fantastically successful. I am making money hand over fist. I don't feel like I did anything in particular special to make this happen. I just kind of made the city, I felt like, in a way that was good, and maybe I just got lucky and it worked out. But this was only my second city. The first one I stopped using because it was actually officially bugged. Colossal Order sent an email to the people reviewing the game about that. So just be aware that if you're in City Builders because you want a little bit of challenge to your city building experience, maybe pick one of the maps that has less buildable areas. Maybe give yourself some extra challenge because the base game is probably not going to provide it for you. On a related note, in terms of the play modes for Cities Skylines 2, it looks like Sandbox is it. Technically, the game has unlimited money mode as well as a standard mode, but the standard mode, like I said, is so easy, I'm not sure there's much of a difference. I was never ever running into money issues, so the existence of an unlimited money mode versus the standard mode seemed pointless. The game also does not have any scenarios like you found in the early SimCity games, and that's something I would like to see added in the expansions. There were some scenarios added in a few of the Cities Skylines expansions. Get the feeling they probably weren't actually that popular, which I understand. I think for a lot of people, Cities Skylines is very much a sandbox game, but if you are a fan of the SimCity franchise, you might be a little disappointed to see that the sandbox is really the only way to play the game. Okay, now what about the fun factor? Is Cities Skylines 2 fun? Well, honestly, starting a new city is a ton of fun in Cities Skylines 2. In fact, it's probably the most fun I've had in a city builder since SimCity 2000, which was the first city builder I played, so obviously that's high praise. There's enough initial demand for residential, commercial, and industrial in Cities Skylines 2 that you can make a well-rounded city. There's none of that industrial shithole start that you had in SimCity 4. Also, as mentioned, the milestone system now lets you unlock additional city services using points that you gain at each milestone. And that also adds to the fun because you can go straight for the services that you think are going to be most important for the particular kind of city you're building. If you want to make a city that has a lot of transit, go for the transit. If you want to have highways and suburban sprawl, then unlock the highways first thing. It's really up to you, and I think that's a really great addition to the game. The late game is also improved. I think this is maybe the biggest improvement. You do not have nonstop issues with traffic snarls. I mean, traffic is still a big problem, and you can get a lot of traffic jams. There are a lot of traffic jams in New York City. But the important thing is that the city can still function to at least some degree, whereas in City Skylines, if you had a really bad traffic jam, sometimes it felt like the city just kind of gave up. Now the agents are smarter, they'll find different ways of getting where they need to go, and that makes the late game, I think, a lot more enjoyable. However, as I mentioned, City Skylines II seems to be a pretty easy game, and that perhaps is not a good thing for the fun factor. I was starting to feel a little bit of a tinge of boredom at certain points in my playthrough, especially as the city got larger. It felt like I didn't need to do things well in order for my city to succeed, so that might be a problem for some SimCity players, but it really depends on your perspective. Ultimately, I did have a lot of fun making a city in Cities Skylines II. And now we come to the final verdict, the final recommendation. Should you buy Cities Skylines 2 if you are a fan of the SimCity franchise? Well, I think there's a few different ways of looking at this. If you enjoyed the SimCity games because you like dreaming up a city and then making that city real, I think you're going to have a lot of enjoyment from Cities Skylines 2. The only thing here that might be a caveat, which is still unresolved, is mod support. The game does have mod support, but it's not apparently going to go through the Steam Workshop, but through a system Paradox is going to put out, or rather Colossal Order is going to put out. We don't know what that looks like yet, so something to keep in mind if mod support is extremely important for you. Now, if you liked the SimCity franchise because you found it to be a challenge, I think that you'll find some things to appreciate, but you might ultimately be a little bored with Cities Skylines 2. As mentioned, it is a very easy game, in my opinion, and in addition to that, there's no scenarios. There's currently not any sort of challenge modes or more difficult modes that are really going to enhance the difficulty of your experience or sort of put pressure on particular parts of the simulator. And I think there's a certain part of the SimCity audience that just is going to be disappointed by that, because the SimCity games were not extremely hard, but they had aspects to them which could be difficult, where you could enhance the challenge for yourself. I'm not really getting that from Cities Skylines 2. That's something I would like to see added either in expansions, or maybe even if there's something that a modder can come up with that will add a little bit to the game, maybe new scenarios or maybe new restrictions on the simulation that make it a little bit more interesting and difficult for experienced players. Finally, if you like SimCity because you like to build large, realistic cities, if you're that sort of city planner nerd demographic, I think Cities Skylines 2 is generally positive, but a little bit of a mix. The sequel kind of takes all the advantages of the original game and turns them up to 11 or even 12, just enhances that traffic simulation, improves the transit, improves the zoning, improves the ploppables and the city services, and that's all very much appreciated. But on the other hand, the scale of the city simulation in Cities Skylines 2 is still a lot smaller than SimCity 4. To me, it feels very reminiscent of going to, say, a model train show or looking at a really nicely detailed model city for a movie set. There is a ton of detail there, and it looks sometimes beautiful and can be very interesting and dynamic, but ultimately the scale is just smaller than you would find in a real city. Like I mentioned, if you have 25,000 residents, you can get some skyscrapers. New Dork City has 50,000 residents, almost 50,000 residents, and I think it's probably got more skyscrapers in it than the bottom half of the top 50 largest cities in the United States. And that does seem, I mean, it's fine, I guess. It just is a little odd. I was really hoping to find something that in terms of scale might push the boundaries a little bit more, and I'm not really getting that from Cities Skylines 2. Still a very enjoyable game, but I know there are SimCity 4 fans who still really enjoy the just incredible size of the regions that you can get in that game. with tens of millions of residents or more, and that's just, I don't think that's something you're going to really be finding in Cities Skylines 2. On a final note, you might be wondering, is the game stable? Is it bug-free? That's not something I can comment on for everyone, because ultimately I have one computer and it's just my experience, but I found that the game was actually pretty stable and bug-free and had one big problem, and that's the performance. It doesn't perform very well. You're going to need a beefy video card, at least at this time. But other than that, I didn't have major issues with the game crashing. The game felt generally about as stable as the first one. So pretty good. Not a bad experience there. Not something that would prevent me from recommending the game. And on the whole, I think if you're a longtime city builder fan, you're going to like this game. You're probably going to enjoy it, and it's going to be worth the price of admission. It is not yet a game that fully replaces every aspect of the SimCity franchise, and I think it probably never will be. I think that for the next potential for that happening, we'll have to look to Cities Skylines 3 when it comes out in, 2032 or whatever. However, there is no doubt in my mind that this is a positive step for the Cities Skylines franchise, and I think it really cements the franchise's legacy in the city builder genre. So that is my views on Cities Skylines 2 and how it compares to the SimCity franchise. If you are a fan of SimCity, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, if you want a little bit more detail on how the simulation in SimCity and Cities Skylines 2 works, check out my video on that topic. I really go in depth in another video about how those two games compare mechanically under the hood, and it reveals a lot about why each game works exactly the way that it does. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.